Here are 10 true crime stories from the Joe Rogan Experience. Shocking, disturbing, and unforgettable. In episode number 1947, comedian Chris Stefano sat down with Joe Rogan and shared some truly disturbing stories, from his mom's close call with Ted Bundy to wild prison tales about the son of Sam, and even the dark truth behind Henry Lee Lucas.
So, Joe, you know how people always say serial killers look like normal guys? Man, sometimes it's true. But sometimes you can just feel the darkness. Like, my mom had this friend growing up in Utah. She was 18, 19 at the time, just a regular young woman. One day, she meets this guy at the supermarket. Seemed normal enough. He asks her out on a date. She agrees. They go to dinner, sitting at the table. And suddenly she gets this overwhelming, ominous feeling. She told me, "Chris, I looked at him and I felt like there was nothing behind his eyes, just emptiness." Something wasn't right. And it hit her so hard, she actually excused herself to the bathroom, went to a payphone, this was back in the 70s, and called her brother. She said, "You need to pick me up right now." Then she hid in the bathroom until he showed up. Didn't even go back to the table. Just left. Now, here's where it gets creepy. This guy had picked her up from her house. So the next morning, her brother, he's delivering newspapers for his route. It's like 5 a.m., he sees some movement in the bush outside their house. He looks closer, and there's a man hiding there. Beige jacket, lurking. He runs home, tells the family, and when the sister wakes up, she says, "That's him. That's the guy from the date." Fast forward a few years. She's sitting at home, watching TV, and suddenly she sees his face on the news. Ted Bundy, and she realized she had been on a date with Bundy before the world even knew who he was. Before he became Ted Bundy the monster, he was already hunting, already killing. She said the look he gave her that night, that sinister expression, she never forget it. That was the predator in him. Now here's another wild one. My relative TT Jerry, trans, did time in prison. She served on the same cell block as David Berkowitz, the son of Sam, and even Ronald DeFeo Jr. from the Amityville horror murders. She told me flat out, "Chris, son of Sam, didn't kill all those people. He confessed to some, but he was part of a cult. The city pinned everything on him." And then, a few months later, Netflix drops a documentary basically saying the same thing. That Berkowitz wasn't the only killer, that other members of this cult got away with murder. But she said the craziest inmate wasn't Berkowitz. It was Ronald DeFeo. Every morning she'd make him breakfast on a little prison hot plate. And like clockwork, he'd say, "I feel good today. I just didn't kill my grandma." That's the only thing. The man had slaughtered his whole family. And he still believed the only reason he wouldn't get into heaven was because he didn't kill his grandmother. Pure madness. And then, Joe, you brought up Henry Lee Lucas. That guy. Total lunatic. He confessed to hundreds of murders. At one point, they thought he killed like 600 people. But what really happened was the cops started using him to close cases. They'd go, "Hey, Henry, in 1976, a girl was stabbed behind some bush in Indianapolis. Was that you?" And he'd just nod. "Yep, that was me. Killed her with a knife." And the cops would go, "Great, case closed." In reality, he couldn't have committed half of those murders. He was probably a drifter who killed some people, yeah. But he became the scapegoat for unsolved crimes across the country. Cops wanted a conviction, and Henry wanted attention. It's crazy, man. Some of these killers lie to cover their crimes. Others lie just to get famous. Either way, the body count keeps piling up. And you know what's even scarier? Some of these guys, they're so good at pretending to be normal. You'd never know until it's too late. That's why my mom's friend got lucky. She listened to her instincts. She saw something in Bundy's face that night, something demonic, and she ran. Most people wouldn't. They'd stay thinking they're just being paranoid. But that one decision, that's probably what saved her life.
From a near escape with Ted Bundy to shocking prison confessions about the son of Sam and the Amityville horror murders, these are reminders of how close ordinary people have come to true evil. In episode number 1, 1414 of the Joe Rogan Experience brings us into one of the most infamous scandals of recent decades, the case of Jeffrey Epstein. Former CIA officer Mike Baker sits down with Rogan to unpack the bizarre details, the suspicious timeline, and the web of power, privilege, and unanswered questions surrounding Epstein's life and death.
When it comes to Jeffrey Epstein, almost everyone agrees on one thing: the story doesn't add up. Rogan opens with Prince Andrew, Epstein's powerful friend. The interviews with him were strange, awkward, and damaging enough that even the Queen quickly distanced the royal family from the scandal. And that was just one of many connections that made the case so explosive. But the real question hanging over everything: Epstein's death. Did he really kill himself? Rogan asks Baker straight out, and Baker, a career CIA officer, doesn't hesitate. No way, he didn't kill himself. Even Michael Shermer, head of Skeptic magazine, a man who makes a living debunking conspiracy theories, had to admit the evidence didn't fit. Missing tapes, malfunctioning cameras, deleted recordings, and guards who conveniently failed in their duties. Too many coincidences, and let's not forget the bizarre choice of Epstein's cellmate. A hulking ex-cop turned drug runner and convicted. Murderer built like a brick wall. The kind of man you'd cast in a mob movie as the enforcer. He was placed in Epstein's cell, and yet mysteriously claimed he never touched him. The absurdity of the situation felt like a bad script. Epstein, the high-profile prisoner, supposedly watched around the clock, ends up dead in circumstances. That screen-covered dash-up. Then comes the shocking revelation. Bill Clinton flew with Epstein at least 26 times. 26 flights on the infamous Lolita Express. Whether or not you believe in conspiracies, that kind of access and connection makes people raise eyebrows. Epstein wasn't just another rich guy with strange habits, he had proximity to some of the most powerful figures on Earth. So how did he get that power? Rogan and Baker circle around the idea of leverage. Epstein's operation may have been less about personal pleasure and more about control, compromising the rich and famous by recording them with underage girls and then keeping those tapes for insurance. Prince Andrew was allegedly one of those caught in this web. This is where Baker brings his CIA experience into the conversation. Intelligence agencies around the world use honey traps, seduction, and sexual compromise to control targets. The Russians do it. The Israelis, according to Baker, have had huge success with it. But he insists the CIA doesn't rely on this tactic because blackmail always goes sideways eventually. Still, the Epstein scenario looked exactly like a textbook case of long-term compromise. Lure powerful figures into vulnerable positions, document everything, then use that leverage. Even Epstein's partner, Ghislaine Maxwell, seemed to understand this game. When she resurfaced after Epstein's death, she was spotted reading a book about murdered CIA operatives, an eerie choice of material, almost as if she was making a statement. Where she hid, what she knew, and what evidence she may have stashed away remain questions that haunt the case. Did she have a dead man's switch, ready to release incriminating material if anything happened to her? Baker explains how intelligence officers test and reel in targets. At first, it's subtle. Maybe asking for a harmless research paper. Or an open source study, nothing classified, nothing illegal. But once someone provides that, they've crossed the line. They've proven their task able. From there, you ratchet things up, bit by bit, until the target is compromised. That's why Epstein's setup looks so believable as a control operation. He wasn't just partying with celebrities. He was building leverage, but leverage for what? That's the puzzle. Epstein had money, but not the kind of fortune that could explain the scale of his operations. Planes, mansions, private islands, all of it required funding. So was it really just for money? Or was he serving some larger purpose, providing powerful people to intelligence networks, foreign or domestic? Some point to Mossad, others to shadowy financiers. What's clear is that Epstein cultivated access and power thrives on proximity. To more power. Then there's the forensic evidence. Famed medical examiner Michael Baden reviewed Epstein's autopsy and went on record. The neck fractures were consistent with strangulation, not hanging. Baden had never seen those kinds of injuries in typical suicides. His verdict? Epstein was murdered. That statement from one of the most respected forensic pathologists in the world only deepened suspicions. Add to that the guards, the ones who were supposed to check on Epstein every 30 minutes, suddenly failing to perform their duties. Their testimony riddled with inconsistencies. Some speculated they might end up suicided themselves, silenced before they could reveal too much. And when you consider the size and strength of Epstein's cellmate, the picture grows darker. If someone wanted Epstein gone, they had both the means and the muscle to make it happen. Rogan points out how quickly the story faded from headlines. Despite its scale, sex trafficking, billionaires, royalty, presidents, spies, the Epstein scandal was buried under the endless churn of news stories. Attention spans are short and the media cycle moves fast. But for many, the Epstein case became the ultimate proof that powerful networks can bend reality, bury truth, and erase accountability. As Baker says, Epstein's world was about leverage. And leverage explains everything, why Epstein was protected. For so long, why he skated by with sweetheart deals, why he seemed untouchable, until suddenly he wasn't. The second he became more liability than asset, his fate was sealed.
From royal scandals to CIA tactics, to missing tapes and suspicious deaths, the story remains one of the clearest examples of power shielding itself from justice. And yet, as Rogan says, the news cycle moved on, leaving us with more questions than answers. In this episode of the Joe Rogan Experience, we dive into one of the darkest chapters in American history, the Manson family murders. Joe is joined by journalist and author Tom O'Neill, whose decades of research uncovered disturbing cracks in the official narrative. What he reveals might just change everything you thought you knew about Charles Manson, the Tate murders, and the shadowy forces surrounding them.
You know, Joe, the thing that first pulled me into this whole rabbit hole was just a simple magazine assignment. Back in the late 1990s, I was hired to write a quick piece for a magazine about the 30th anniversary of the Manson murders. It was supposed to be a 2-month gig, nothing too deep. Just recap the Tate LaBianca killings, talk about Manson, the helter-skelter motive, the standard stuff, but the deeper I dug, the stranger it got. And before I knew it, what was supposed to be a 2-month article turned into a 20-year obsession. I just couldn't let it go because nothing added up. The story we'd all been told, the story in Vincent Bugliosi's book Helter Skelter, it just didn't hold water once I started pulling on the threads. First off, the motive itself. Bugliosi sold the idea that Manson ordered his followers to commit the murders to ignite a race war he called Helter Skelter. According to Bugliosi, Manson believed the Beatles were sending him messages through their music, telling him to start this apocalyptic conflict. It's crazy, right? And it worked. People bought it because it was so bizarre it had to be true. But once I started interviewing people close to the case, lawyers, investigators, even some of the Manson family members, I realized nobody actually believed in Helter Skelter. Not then, not now. For example, one of the defense attorneys told me flat out, that whole thing was made up. We knew it in the courtroom, and the prosecution knew it too. Manson himself, in different interviews, would scoff at it. He had a different reality, one tied up with drugs, with influence, with power, but not some fantasy Beatles apocalypse. And then I found records showing that Manson had been arrested multiple times before the murders. He was on parole. And yet somehow, no matter what he did, he kept getting released. Every time. This guy had violated parole over and over. Drugs, weapons, stolen cars, underage girls, things that would have sent any normal parolee straight back to prison for years. But Manson, he was untouchable. Why? Well, the records hinted at something bigger. It looked like Manson was being protected by federal agencies, possibly even being used in some kind of covert program. And when I started pressing into that, I hit a wall. Records disappeared, agencies stonewalled me. People got nervous when I asked questions. One of the craziest things I uncovered was about a psychiatrist named Jolyon West. He was deeply connected to MKUltra, the CIA's mind control experiments. This guy worked with the government for decades, studying how LSD and psychological manipulation could be used to control people. And guess who he just happened to be tied to? Charles Manson. I found evidence that Manson and his followers had been frequenting a clinic in Haight-Ashbury, San Francisco in the late 1960s. That clinic was receiving funding through CIA sub-projects linked to MKUltra, and the doctors there? They were experimenting on people with LSD, not patients, not volunteers, just street people. And Manson was hanging around there, getting access to drugs, learning techniques, soaking it all up. So you start to wonder, Joe, was Charles Manson just some deranged cult leader? Or was he part of something much darker, maybe even a product of government experiments? And then there's the way the LAPD handled the Tate murders themselves. Did you know, on the night of the killings, neighbors reported screams, gunshots, even people fleeing the property, but the police didn't respond? Multiple witnesses came forward saying they saw strange figures on the property hours before the murders. One man even said he saw what looked like a military helicopter overhead. None of that ever made it into the official case. And take this, one of Manson's closest followers, Tex Watson, was arrested in Texas shortly after the murders. Normally, you'd extradite a guy like that right away. But in Tex's case, they delayed his extradition for 9 months. Why? Well, during those 9 months, his brain was essentially fried with heavy doses of psych meds. By the time he finally stood trial in California, Tex couldn't even explain what happened. He was mentally gone? Convenient, right? There were also strange ties to celebrities in Hollywood. Sharon Tate, Roman Polanski, Jay Sebring, they weren't just random victims. They were connected to the Hollywood drug scene, and some say even to the world of intelligence. I interviewed people who swore the house on Shallow Drive was being used as a kind of surveillance or blackmail spot where famous people were filmed in compromising positions. If that's true, then these murders weren't about helter-skelter at all. They were about silencing people and covering up operations, and it's not just conspiracy talk, real evidence backs this up. There are documents missing from LAPD archives, case files that just vanished, evidence that was destroyed, witnesses who were intimidated into silence, and journalists, good ones, who started poking into these angles suddenly had careers that evaporated. One of the eeriest interviews I did was with a former Manson family associate who told me Charlie wasn't running the show. He was a pawn, they used him, then they cut him loose. And when I pressed him on who they were, he clammed up. Wouldn't say a word, Dodd. The more you look, the more the official story looks like a cover. Bugliosi himself, the prosecutor, wasn't exactly clean either. He had his own scandals and plenty of reasons to steer the story away from anything that pointed to government connections or intelligence programs. And Joe, that's why I spent 20 years writing my book. I didn't want to just put out another helter-skelter rehash. I wanted to show people how much we still don't know and how much was buried. Because if the truth ever came out, it would shake a lot of people in power. So, yeah, when people ask me today, what do you think really happened? I tell them straight, the official narrative of the Tate murders doesn't add up. There's too much evidence pointing in another direction. And once you see it, you can't unsee it.
And there you have it. Chilling revelations from journalist Tom O'Neill, whose relentless investigation shows that the Manson murders were far more than just a cult story. If you thought Helter Skelter was the whole truth, think again. This is just one of many stories where history isn't what it seems. Stay tuned. More dark truths are still to come. Episode number 150 of the JRE MMA show brought out one of the darkest and most bizarre true crime stories ever told on the podcast. The case of Rodney Alcala, better known as the dating game killer. A man who managed to hide his monstrous crimes in plain sight, even while appearing on national television. This is the disturbing story of a serial killer who fooled the world.
Man, so I was watching 2020ths the other day. Yeah, I'm old now. I like sitting there watching those crime docs with commercials and everything. And this one comes on called The Dating Game Killer. I couldn't believe it, bro. This dude was an actual serial killer, like a full-on predator in the 70s, and he was on national television. smiling, joking, playing along on the dating game. Think about that, Joe. He already had bodies before that show. He'd been killing for years. One of the early ones they talked about was this poor woman up in Montana. She and her boyfriend had gone on a trip, got into a fight, and he just left her. Man just walked away. She's stranded, vulnerable, and that's when Alcala picks her up. He murders her, and nobody finds her body until decades later. And here's the sickest part. She was pregnant when he killed her. Now, imagine living. In the 60s and 70s, no internet, no cell phones. No GPS. If a woman went missing, there wasn't much anybody could do. And predators like Alcala knew that. Women were at risk because you couldn't track them, and this guy took advantage of it. He racked up victims, and then, bold as hell, he goes on the dating game. Dude, you can still find the video. He comes walking out with this creepy confidence, smiling for the camera. And nobody in the audience knew. The host didn't know. The contestant didn't know. To them, he was just another bachelor trying to win a date. That's why they started calling him the dating game killer, and he really did look scary, man. Even when you watch that old footage, there's just something off about him. Like, behind the smile, you can see the darkness. Later, when they finally caught him, investigators said he had this huge collection of photos, hundreds of women, kids, strangers. They were convinced a lot of those faces never made it home, but the way they finally caught him, Joe, is wild. He wasn't taken down for the murders first. He got caught trying to abduct a little girl from school. That's what nailed him. And once he was in custody, the cases started piling up. The detectives matched him to victim after victim, state after state. And when reporters came to see him later in prison, they said it was chilling. He'd been rotting in there for years, but when they started bringing up the names of the women he killed, it was like his face lit up. He was frail, dying, but just hearing about those times sent him into this weird euphoria. He relived it. Like he enjoyed remembering it. That's pure evil, man. What's even crazier is the court let him represent himself in one of his trials. Imagine that, Rodney Alcala acting as his own lawyer. Bro, he questioned himself on the stand for like 4 or 5 hours. Literally talking to himself. Mr. Alcala, did you commit these crimes? Well, let me tell you. Like, what the hell? And the jury just had to sit there and watch this performance. It's nuts. But that's what happened. He lost? Of course, every time one of these maniacs tries to be their own attorney, they tank. There was another guy in Long Island who shot a bunch of people on a subway. He acted as his own lawyer, too. And when witnesses took the stand, he'd yell, "You're lying, you shot me." Like he forgot he was the defendant. Out of his mind, man, but that's the thing about Alcala. He wasn't just mentally ill, he was methodical, predatory, calculated. Some people are broken and you can see it. But this guy? He blended in, hid behind charm, acted normal enough to get on TV. That's the scariest part. He didn't look like a monster until it was too late. And here's another crazy point. Women love these serial killer shows. They'll binge hours of Dateline, 2020ths, Mindhunter. And you start to wonder, could someone like Alcala still exist today? With all the DNA, cameras, cell phone tracking, you'd think no. But the truth is, yeah, they do. There are still active serial killers out there. Technology makes it harder, but it doesn't erase evil. Some of them are smart enough, careful enough to keep hunting. That's what makes Alcala's story so disturbing. He wasn't some shadowy figure hiding in the dark. He was on television.
That was the dating game killer, a man who turned national TV into his hunting ground, hiding in plain sight while carrying out unspeakable crimes. In episode number 1726 of the Joe Rogan Experience, author Chuck Palahniuk opens up about the most devastating moment of his life, the shocking murder of his father. What begins as a story about chance and love quickly unravels into a chilling tale of fate, violence, and eerie coincidences that feel almost pre-written.
Joe asked him if there had ever been anything so horrific in his life that he couldn't imagine talking about it. Chuck paused and said, "Except for my father's murder, not really. It happened in May of 1999. His dad had answered a personals. Ad in the newspaper, the headline read, Kismet. That word means fate. The woman's name was Rita. She was a lawyer, brilliant, smart, and she'd once worked in the prison system. Chuck explained that his dad was completely taken with her, but Rita had a past, and a dangerous one. She'd married a man she met while doing legal work, even helped him get out of prison. Later, he sexually abused her daughter. She divorced him, pressed charges, and was preparing to send him back to prison. That man swore that if he ever caught her with another man, he would kill them both. Chuck's dad, meanwhile, was planning to protect her. He prepared his mountain house for her to stay safely with him until the trial. He cleaned it spotless, stocked it with food, and even spent hours moving a massive boulder that had fallen across his mountain road. After clearing it, he made a sign and named it Kismet Rock, a playful nod to how they'd met. But fate had a darker plan. When his dad went to pick her up, Rita's ex-husband was waiting. He ambushed them. He shot Chuck's father, and both of them fled inside her home for cover. The ex set the house on fire. The coroner would later determine they were already dead before the flames consumed the place. Chuck described the details. Soberly, the bullet had ruptured his father's diaphragm. It meant he didn't die instantly. For 20 agonizing minutes, every breath filled the space below his lungs with air, slowly suffocating him as his breaths grew shallower. He suffocated before the fire reached them. It sounds horrific enough. But Chuck explained it was part of a haunting pattern, because his father's earliest memory was almost identical. As a little boy in Idaho, Chuck's dad had lived with a large Ukrainian family. One day his own father snapped. With a rifle in hand, he walked through the house in heavy logging boots, calling his son's name. He had already killed Chuck's grandmother, and he was hunting for his son. Chuck's father hid under a bed as his father tried to lure him out to kill him, and then turned the gun on himself. Those were his earliest memories, hiding under a bed, listening to his father hunt him with a rifle, and decades later, Chuck's father would die in almost the same way, shot by a man with a gun, and once again a bed played a role. In the fire, the only reason his father's body was preserved was because a bed from the second floor collapsed and shielded them. The same object that once saved him as a boy ended up covering him in death. And then there was the ad. Kismet. Fate. And the boulder that inexplicably rolled down that road, blocking his father, delaying him just enough to be caught in the ambush. Chuck told Joe that it's hard to dismiss all those eerie coincidences. Maybe it really was fate, maybe a cycle coming full circle. He admitted, maybe I'm just someone looking for significance, but I'll take comfort where I can find it.
That was Chuck Palahniuk's heartbreaking account of his father's murder, a story that proves sometimes reality is darker, stranger, and far more haunting than any fiction could ever be. In episode number 1220 of the Joe Rogan Experience, Joey Diaz dives into one of the rawest and most unforgettable stories from his life, his time in the Department of Corrections. What starts as a prison transfer quickly turns into a tale of heat, noise, and survival inside one of Colorado's toughest facilities.
Joey explains that after his sentencing, they shipped him straight to the Department of Corrections. That's where it gets nitty-gritty, he says. Setting the stage, he describes walking into the prison in Cajon City, Colorado. This wasn't county jail anymore. This was the real thing. The building itself was 6 or 7 stories high, a massive structure packed with inmates. Joey ended up on the 3rd floor in August, when the heat and humidity were unbearable. With only a tiny window in the cell, he says he could hardly breathe. It was like being stuck in a tin can, baking in the sun, and it didn't let up. Daytime meant sweating nonstop. At night, the air didn't cool down. It just turned into a suffocating, noisy madhouse. Joey makes one of his trademark comparisons, saying, "If you think black people talk loud at a movie theater, don't ever go to prison. In there, everyone's talking, yelling, laughing, arguing. All night long, you never get silence. You never get rest. The schedule was strict and brutal. Back then, inmates were only allowed 2 showers a week and 1 hour outside per day. The rest of the time, locked in your cell, left with nothing but heat, sweat, and the constant sound of voices echoing through the tears. Joey recalls that the first week was the easiest, only because that's when they put new inmates through intake and testing. He had to go through every type of evaluation, math tests, English tests, psychological assessments. They even showed him a bunch of pictures and ran him through psychiatry checks. Blood was drawn, paperwork was filled out, and everything was documented. Then came the point system. Joey explains how they measured you by details from your personal life. If you had a high school diploma, that was a point. If you were employed at the time of your arrest, another point. Paying rent, that counted too. These little dots added up, and the more points you had, the better your placement in the system. Joey remembers getting several points from his background, which helped, but it didn't change the daily grind of prison life. Day after day, the routine was the same. Wake up drenched in sweat, line up for one of 3 basic meals. Try to keep yourself occupied in a cell that felt like an oven. Then, maybe once a day, you'd get a chance to step outside for an hour. He emphasizes how quickly the novelty wears off. The first week, you think you're handling it. By the second, the crushing boredom and heat set in. The way Joey tells it, you can almost feel the suffocating air. Hear the endless chatter bouncing off concrete walls and sense the grinding repetition of life inside. He doesn't glorify it, he lays it bare. A week turns into a month, and a month turns into a cycle of sweat, noise, and waiting. He ends the story by reflecting on the cold truth. Prison isn't about punishment in a dramatic sense. It's about slowly grinding you down with the simplest, most uncomfortable realities until you're worn out.
That's Joey Diaz in his purest form, taking something harsh, ugly, and punishing, and laying it out with brutal honesty and a touch of humor. He gives us a glimpse into life inside Canyon City's Department of Corrections, and a reminder of why you never want to end up there. In episode number 1362 of the Joe Rogan Experience, Joe and comedian Lenny Clark trade wild stories of their past, from rowdy nights and comedy crash pads to shocking encounters with people who later turned out to be cold-blooded killers.
Lenny starts off with a story from his early days living in the barracks. It was this cheap apartment packed with comedians, 14 of them crammed into a place with barely 4 bedrooms. Rent was dirt cheap, just $165 a month, split between whoever was around. Out-of-town comics could always crash there. Keys were literally kept under the mat, but their neighbor, she hated them. An old lady who lived on the 3rd floor. Lenny laughs as he recalls how they'd party all night. Break windows just for fun, even keeping a window repair guy on standby. The old lady would scream from her place, "I only live to see you dead." He'd send her flowers sometimes, and she'd just chuck them off her balcony, cursing him out. Then one day, she really did end up murdered, brutally, cut up. The cops showed up at Lenny's place to question him. He was hungover, puking in a bucket, when an officer asked, "Did you murder the lady?" Lenny just looked at him like, "Come on, really?" He didn't even want to climb 3 flights of stairs to visit her, let alone kill her. They never solved the case. Joe jumps in with his own chilling story. Back when he was training, he knew a guy who later got arrested for a horrific crime. The guy had allegedly been part of a torture session, breaking someone's bones with a hammer, injecting them with cocaine to keep them awake, cutting off their hands, and eventually killing them. Joe remembers asking him about it once, and the guy's evasive response, "I don't know nothing," was enough to make him realize this friend knew a lot more than he was saying. Lenny nods and says he knows plenty of people who turned out to be murderers. One name that pops up, Johnny Martirano, a Boston hitman, notorious, even featured on 60 Minutes. Lenny recalls running into him at a supermarket like it was nothing. "Hey, Johnny," he'd say, trying to stay cool, knowing this was a man who had killed dozens of people. Lenny then tells a story about an old high school buddy, Bubba, funniest guy I ever met. Bubba once stole 12 red Corvettes in a single night, lined them up, and found a briefcase full of cash in one of them. Instead of hiding it, he marched into his high school cafeteria and bought lunch for everyone, announcing, "Lunch is on me." But Bubba's life spiraled. He wound up in Walpole, the maximum security prison in Massachusetts. Lenny recalls going there to perform a comedy show. The guards warned him, "If we swab you and find even drug residue on your clothes, you're..." "Staying here?" Lenny quickly changed before heading in. On stage, mid-performance, Bubba jumped up to say hi, under an assumed name. Years later, Bubba murdered a guy for talking shit, got caught, and went back in for life. Joe shakes his head. "Man, in the nightclub business, you're gonna meet some people who've done some horrible shit." That sparks another story. Lenny remembers a guy who once sawed someone's head off with a samurai sword and tossed it on another guy's lawn, all drug-related. Joe reacts in disbelief, but Lenny just shrugs as if this was the kind of insanity that floated around. There are circles back in the day that then Lenny talks about the drug days, before crack was everywhere. Back then, it was freebasing, something only people with money did. He remembers being at an MBTA station in South Boston with Sam Kinison, taking a hit, and suddenly feeling like his heart had stopped. He could barely breathe, hearing people around him panic. What do we do with the body? He laughs now, but says later doctors told him he had damaged his heart permanently from cocaine. There's a small mountain in Peru missing, he jokes. Admitting just how much he used to do, the whole conversation swings between comedy, crime, and chaos, with both Joe and Lenny trading stories of run-ins with people who weren't just shady characters, but killers, torturers, and lifelong criminals.
And that wraps up episode number 1362, where laughter and true crime collided, as Joe and Lenny shared memories that were as hilarious as they were chilling. In episode number 1992 of the Joe Rogan Experience, the conversation takes a chilling turn as the guest recalls visiting one of the most disturbing true crime locations in America, the infamous Villisca Axe murder house.
So there's this one time. One of the creepiest places we've ever been. Have you ever heard of the Villisca Axe murders? Back in 1912, in this tiny little town of Villisca, Iowa, a man walked into a small house and slaughtered an entire family. 2 parents and 6 kids, all in one night. Every single one of them gone. And the craziest part, no one ever got caught. To this day, it's still unsolved. Now, when you drive into that town, they don't hide it. Right in front of the house, there's a big sign that says Villisca Axe Murder House, and it's painted like it's dripping blood. Imagine living next door and having to see that every day, like, hey man, maybe take that down. But that's the reality. That place has become part of the town's identity. So we went there thinking, it'd just be another creepy stop on the list. But stepping inside, completely different vibe. The second you walk in, it's heavy. Our guide starts explaining what happened, the layout of the house where each body was found. And while he's talking, one of our buddies suddenly says he feels sick, like he's about to throw up. The air felt thick, the energy oppressive. That doesn't happen to us all the time, but here it did. It was bad enough that halfway through we had to leave. And here's where it gets really dark. The killer didn't even use the sharp edge of the axe. He used the blunt side, smashing heads in one by one. You can still see the dents in the ceiling where he was swinging down. Think about that. A small wooden house, creaky hallways, kids sleeping literally steps away from the parents. And somehow, he moved through all of them without anyone escaping. 4 kids in one room, 2 little girls downstairs. One of them had invited a friend for the night, and none of them made it. The most disturbing part, though, is what came after. Reports said the killer mutilated the bodies, and when he got to the little girls downstairs, man, this is hard to even say. He unclothed them, sat there, and pleasured himself next to their bodies. And there was this weird detail. He had taken a slab of bacon from the kitchen and set it next to them while he did it. That's how twisted this was. And then he vanished. Never happened again, never caught. Just gone. Now, of course, people started asking who the hell could do something like that. There were a couple of main suspects, a local businessman named Jones, who had some bad blood with the family, and a creepy reverend in town who had a reputation as a peeping Tom, but neither of them had ever done anything like this before. It didn't fit, Then, years later, a new theory popped up that blew everything open. An author released a book called The Man from the Train. She claimed that the Viliska murders weren't random at all. They were part of a series, a single serial killer who rode the railways across the Midwest, stopping in small towns, hiding in barns, and slaughtering entire families. His name was Paul Mueller. And the way he killed matched almost perfectly. Always the blunt side of the axe. Always covering mirrors and windows afterward like he couldn't face himself. Sometimes he'd sit down in the kitchen and eat a meal next to the bodies. And nearly every crime scene was within a few hundred feet of a railroad junction. The authors of that book believe Mueller was responsible for at least 14 confirmed family massacres and maybe as many as 25 more. That's nearly 100 victims, and possibly even a case in Germany that matched his pattern. Imagine that, this guy riding trains, creeping into barns, watching families for days, then waiting for the right moment. The Viliska family had actually just come home from a church service the night they died. He might have been waiting the whole time. Hidden nearby. And think about the method. Using the back of the axe wasn't just sadism, it was efficiency. If you use the blade, it sticks. In the skull, you lose time pulling it out. But with the blunt side, you crush and move on. Faster, quieter. That's how he managed to kill 8 people in one house without being stopped. Standing in that house. Knowing all of this, you can't help but feel it. Whether it's a placebo or not, the air feels thicker. You're walking through the parents' room, down the little hallway to where the kids were, imagining how he went room to room. And once you hear the details, the bacon, the mirrors, the windows covered, it sticks in your head. You realize this wasn't just one night of madness. It was part of a pattern, and here's the most chilling part. They never caught Paul Mueller. He just disappeared into history.
And that wraps up episode number 1992, where the conversation unearthed the haunting story of the Viliska Axe murders, a century-old crime that still sends shivers today. Some mysteries never really fade. They just keep staring back from the shadows. In episode number 2295 of the Joe Rogan Experience, former undercover FBI agent Scott Payne shares one of the most harrowing moments of his career while infiltrating the Outlaws motorcycle gang.
I was deep undercover, working a case that had already gone on for over a year and a half. We were building trust, getting inside, and the operation had turned into something huge. There was supposed to be a drug shipment coming in, and my crew was set to deliver it to another crew. We were running protection for the deal, and we did it in Brockton. Several outlaws decided to jump in on it, and that made everything more dangerous. Now, the government wanted more than just the drugs. They wanted evidence of the conversations, the planning. The assistant United States attorney told me, if they talk about this at the clubhouse, we'd love to have that on tape. So that night, before the deal was supposed to go down, I went into their clubhouse wired to the hilt. I had a hidden video device, an audio recorder, and a live transmitter so the team could listen. What I didn't know was that I was about to walk into the most dangerous night of my life. When I arrived, they told me they weren't ready yet. I pushed back a little, being smart, not picking up on the tension in the room. Later, when I looked back at the video, I realized what I had missed. When I turned my head, the guys' faces went stone cold. They knew something wasn't right. I didn't see it in the moment. One of the outlaws, a guy I was close to, someone I'd spent countless hours with, asked me to come with him. He led me into a door I had never been through before, down into a tight basement stairwell where I couldn't even stand up straight. The space was cramped, suffocating. And then they brandished their weapons. He looked at me and said, "There's a lot going on. It's my job to protect my brothers. I need you to write down your full name, your address, your phone number, and I need you to take off all your clothes. I've got to check you for a wire." That was the nightmare scenario. If I hadn't been wired, it would have been humiliating but survivable. But I was carrying multiple devices. At that point, the thought hits you. Do I fight? Do I try to escape? But upstairs, there were 10 more outlaws. The door was fortified with deadbolts and steel bars, and I was already surrounded by armed men. Fighting would have been suicide, so I wrote my name down, but in that moment, my adrenaline spiked so hard I forgot my middle name. That's what happens when your body goes into survival mode. Time slows, sounds get muffled, everything feels like it's happening in slow motion. I kept repeating the wrong middle name in my head, panicking quietly until it finally came. Back to me, Scott Andrew Calloway. I scribbled it down, then came the strip search. I pulled my pants down, took off my boots, stripped nearly naked while they searched me. I kept waiting for the moment they'd find the wire. Inside, I was screaming for reassurance, silently begging my closest contact to give me a look that everything was okay. He did, but of course he had no idea I was really undercover. The search went on. At one point, one of them grabbed a piece of my clothing and started kneading it, feeling through it. I knew the wire was there. I watched his hand move closer and closer to it, my heart racing so loud I thought they could hear it. I even let out an audible sigh on the recording because I thought I was about to be caught. And then, by sheer luck, he stopped just short of finding it. That moment could have ended in blood. I even had a plan. If he found the wire, I was ready. To bluff, to say, the gig is up. I'm an undercover FBI agent. I can walk out of here and we can settle this in court, or all hell's going to break loose. But the truth is, it would have been a bluff. My cover team couldn't hear me from inside that clubhouse. The walls and interference blocked everything. I would have been on my own. When it was over, I pulled my clothes back on and tried to play it off, venting my anger later in front of them, saying things like, "Tomorrow, I'm stripping all of you out in the parking lot." They let me rant, but inside I was shaken. Later that night, when I turned in my equipment, I found out just how close I came to death. My team told me they had heard something over the radio during my first interaction in that basement. These guys, sharp investigators, street smart as hell, had sensed something was off. They pulled close, suited up in vests, and prepared to breach the building. Because they knew the door was fortified, their plan was to literally ram a van through the cinderblock wall to get me out. By then, backup units were racing down from Boston with lights and sirens, ready to storm the clubhouse. My case agent, a good friend of mine from the FBI Academy, told me later that as he was speeding down the highway, he felt like he was right there in the basement with me. And I told him straight, "You weren't." Because in that basement, stripped down, surrounded by armed outlaws, wired up and praying they didn't find it, I was completely alone.
Stories like this remind us how unpredictable life can be, and how a single moment can change everything. It's a chilling reminder of the darker side of human nature, the kind you never see coming until it's too late. In episode number 1934 of the Joe Rogan Experience, Joe and Lex Fridman dive into one of the most disturbing cases in recent memory, where a man's Google search history exposed the horrifying details of a planned murder.
"What are you doing with that girlfriend, Lex? She keeps nagging you, doesn't respect you. You're gonna have to break up with her, or maybe murder her." He laughs, brushes it off, joking, buddy, just joking, but then pivots. Because sometimes that's exactly how it starts. Dark jokes that become dark realities. He brings up the case of a man who murdered his wife, and the trail of evidence was sitting in his Google searches. Lex perks up, asking, "Wait, what's the story again?" Joe lays it out. This guy stayed up all night, literally Googling things like how to dismember a body, how long before a body starts to smell, best ways to dispose of a body, can you be charged with murder without a body, and on into the morning. Joe shakes his head. How dumb do you have to be? Just straight up searching murder tips on Google. Lex wonders aloud if maybe the guy wasn't just dumb, but maybe on some kind of psych meds or stimulants that made him reckless. Joe isn't sure, but he does point out they found a bloody knife. This wasn't just fantasy. The man's wife really was dead. That leads Lex into a bigger question. Maybe some people's brains are just broken. Maybe they're psychopaths, or extreme narcissists, or sociopaths. And the world's full of them. Some are criminals, but others, maybe they're running hedge funds or companies that kill people with products. Same type of brain, just different outlets. Joe nods. saying, yeah, we've all seen it. Some of these people are dangerous, not because they're violent, but because they're smart, charming, manipulative. And some, like this murderer, are just sloppy, leaving behind a digital confession in Google's search bar. They pull up an article. Brian Walsh? Prosecutors said his search history was like a roadmap to his wife's murder. Experts debated whether it would be enough to convict. Joe shakes his head again. I mean, come on. You Google, how long does DNA last the same night your wife disappears? That's about as damning as it gets. Lex shifts gears. He talks about watching the Dahmer dramatization and the documentaries. It made me realize some people's brains really are broken. Not that I sympathize, but you start to understand, they're wired differently. They can't help it. Joe laughs. What, are you a Dahmer sympathizer now, Lex? But he gets it. Some people really are hardwired to think and act in ways the rest of us can't fathom, Dom, and then the conversation takes that philosophical. Joe and Lex turn. Lex asks, do we really need emotions? Life is suffering. Every hello eventually becomes a goodbye. Couldn't we just engineer happiness? Get rid of the suffering? Joe pushes back. Evolution, he says, is like a giant computation machine. Billions of years of trial and error shaped human beings the way we are. And now, a bunch of software engineers from San Francisco think they can just rewrite the code of humanity? You really want to mess with that? But isn't that just part of evolution too? The monkeys eventually start messing with things. And Joe shakes his head, half laughing, half serious. Yeah, and maybe that's why we don't see aliens. Because the monkeys always screw it up in the end.
That's episode number 1934 of The Joe Rogan Experience, where a killer's Google history opens the door to bigger questions about psychopathy, technology, and whether our evolution is driving us forward or straight off a cliff.